I'm Chance Dorland, and this is Military City, a new podcast from ExpressNews.com. San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christensen was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq back in 2003 and has reported on military-related topics for decades. Each week, it will be my pleasure to join Sig to discuss the military stories important to San Antonio, both from today and the past. Now, Sig, today is our first episode of Military City, and as we discussed actually as a preview of this new program earlier in the month on another ExpressNews.com podcast called In Depth, you talked about San Antonio and America's military past. The thing that's really essential for understanding those two things here in the present is to know what's come in the past, to know the context. And that's something I hope that we'll do here on the program. So for today, our first edition of this program, we're going to feature a moment in the past that you yourself were a part of.
We've got troops in black uniforms on the other side of the ridge over there, high area. They've been spreading out. They're armed and hiding behind a tree line.
Yeah, they're definitely hiding behind trees.
We're moving over to behind the track, getting some protection. They're walking and standing. Some look like they're crouching. Some are running over to the right, trying to flank us, spreading out. Looks like one's running away. They're all wearing black uniforms. Boy, they're in plain view, too.
So, Sig, let's get to it. What did we just hear?
What you heard was the last firefight that the 3rd Infantry Division's 369 Armored Battalion was involved in before the end of the invasion, which came at Saddam International Airport. The battalion was rolling in to the airport at dawn, and in the distance, someone spotted some Iraqis wearing black ninja outfits. That's the Saddam Fedayeen. That was a fanatical militia loyal to Saddam, and they would frequently fight to the death. They stood up with us toe-to-toe for 30 minutes in a firefight before we went on in to the airport. They were hopelessly outnumbered, they were outgunned, and they stood and fought with us for half an hour. And there's a backstory to that we'll get to that involves Saddam Hussein himself.
So tell me, how did you get put in this situation? As we've discussed many times in the past, and I just briefly mentioned now, you were embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division during that U.S.-led invasion of Iraq back in 2003. But specifically, this incident that we've just heard a clip of, we'll hear a few more before the end of today's program. How did you find yourself with those troops that day?
Well, we were embedded with a close air support team. So I was with Captain Shad McGann and Senior Airman Dan Housley. Shad commanded the 2 close air support teams that called in airstrikes for 369 Armor. And those were critical roles that those 2 men played. They probably were responsible for killing more Iraqis from the berm in Kuwait all the way to Baghdad than any other single soldier or airman in the entire 3rd Infantry Division was. Those guys went out there and called airstrikes night and day. And because they did that, they cleared the road for the division. And specifically 369 was a spearhead element of the division through most of the invasion. And as a result, we were often in the middle of fighting and battles that took place from the start to the end. That's how that worked. And so I'm with them. I'm literally living with them. I'm in their truck, which is a Humvee, a soft-skinned Humvee, which has jelly windows. You could shoot an arrow in it and kill someone. It was not well protected, and that was one reason why those guys all got medals as far as I'm concerned. It took guts to drive that truck into places where people were shooting at you because there was absolutely no protection. And their job, which they did every day without an hour off, let alone a day off, was to was to kill the enemy by dropping bombs on them. And the close air support guy on the ground, the TACP as they're called, Tactical Air Control Party, the reason why they're there is so they can visually identify the enemy, pinpoint their location, and clear the pilot who's flying above to drop the bomb. That's how they ensure that civilians aren't hit. And it was well done work from the beginning to the end. We were driving. We had been on the road the night before and stopped. I'm not entirely sure why we stopped, although we did lose a reporter and a soldier, Sergeant Wilbert Davis. Their Jeep flipped into a ditch, and the column stopped. They drowned, of all things, and we simply stayed there all night, and we aren't entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure to this day why we just stayed there. But the next morning, we rolled out before dawn. We got on the highway, and we were headed toward the final objective, which was Saddam International Airport. That was the battalion's final objective. Once that objective was secured, the war was basically over for 3rd Infantry Division, except for what people would call mopping up. And that's pretty much what happened. So we're on our way into the airport. We're on a major road. And then suddenly the Fedayeen come out. They're on a bit of an escarpment. And they come out and they challenge all of us. We must have had several hundred men with all kinds of different weapons, and I would guess there might have been a couple of dozen of them.
So let's hear some more of some of the audio that you recorded when all this happened, featuring a little bit more of the explosions and gunfire that you and the soldiers experienced that day.
They are armed. They're armed. We got some fire coming. They're firing back. What was that? What was that?
So tell me more about this. So you encountered this group that, as you mentioned, Sig, was much smaller than the force that you were traveling with. But they challenged you, and you were in these vehicles that, for the most part, these are things that I would feel uncomfortable driving on a highway, let alone facing enemy fire. So I know that when that started, there was a quick decision to get out of the vehicles. Tell me about why that was done.
Well, Sergeant Major Kaiser gave the order to dismount, and Shad and Dan stopped. And I looked over at the ridge, pulled out a pair of binoculars, and I saw the Iraqis forming up. They were easy to see. They were wearing black. And Shad decided to try to call in some airstrikes. So he got on the radio, and he was having trouble raising anybody on the radio. And finally, he just said, "Let's get the hell out of here." We left, so I followed him, and I got behind the 577 command and control vehicle that's used by one of the commanders. It's a really big truck.
And that's quite different than some of these other vehicles we're talking about that would be easily to be hit by enemy fire with.
It's a very well protected vehicle with tracks on it, and tracks are critical because if you're hiding behind a truck, something fired under it can get past you. It can hit you. And in fact, when this battle started, very early on, the Fedayeen fired 4 RPGs directly at our truck. They must have seen us and zeroed in on us. And we just got out. I mean, less than 45 seconds after we got out of the truck, they fired on it. And one of the RPGs blew up in front of the truck. Another one blew up over my head. It was a pretty errant shot. And one skipped underneath the truck, and I saw it. It was a big black blur.
As you mentioned, able to get underneath the truck because it wasn't tracks.
That's right. It was a wheeled vehicle. And that RPG came off the ground, went up in the air. It hit a soldier named Cervantes Williams in the breastplate of his armor. It did not explode. It just simply had not cycled. So it hit him, and the fin of the RPG came down on the top of his wrist, cut his hand deep enough for him to bleed. He got a Purple Heart that day, but he was the luckiest man in the theater of war, because if it had blown up, he would have been killed. And for some reason, it just hadn't cycled. And so Cervantes was the luckiest man in Iraq that morning. And what he said later, and we wrote about it, he said that he was going to keep the vest. He was going to keep it for the rest of his life. And I hope he did.
Yeah, that's because, I mean, not only like being hit by like a rifle shot or even a handgun, I mean, being hit by an RPG, that's it's an enormous amount of power. And so it just struck his plate and like you said, cut his hand a little bit, but lived to tell about it.
Yeah, and there's another half of that story. My stepson, then specialist Jason Roberts, who's now an officer in the Army. Jason was about maybe 10 feet away. He was in that firefight.
You were embedded with your stepson.
It was a complete accident. You know, there's 20,000 people in that division, so it's a division plus. There was a lot of people in it. And so I took Jason and his younger sister to lunch in January before we all broke up. And Jason and I knew we were going to war, but I never thought I'd see him. With 20,000 soldiers in the desert, that's a lot of soldiers.
You'd think they would actively try to not have that happen.
They had no idea. I lived with Jason's mom and helped raise the kids for a while. Took him to daycare. Barbecued for him. He loved my barbecue. Later, we went to Astros games. Did a lot of stuff. Good kid. He's grown up. Has kids of his own. But that day, he was out there.
You were under fire together.
And we were under fire. And so I asked him, I said, how many clips did you use? And he said, I went through 3 clips. So I said, 150 rounds. And he said, yeah. So I got on the sat phone and I called Susan and I said, Sue, remember that boy who had never heard a fly? I said, he fired 150 rounds at the Stamfedin this morning. She said, he didn't. I said, oh, yeah, he did. I said, your son's a killer. It's a funny story because it's like the last thing you'd expect. It's
hard for me to believe as you tell me about this.
It's a bizarre
right
story.
Now. Yeah.
It's like if you play the odds on the lottery, the odds on the lottery are a little bigger than that, but I don't know how much bigger.
I think you're more likely to win the lottery than to have a story like that, Sig. That's quite the tale.
Well, I wouldn't mind winning the lottery either.
Maybe you could do both. So let's get back to this. So as you mentioned, you're hiding behind a more fortified vehicle that has tracks because that would prevent, your death and the death of other soldiers. Tell me more about what's going on. So you've gotten out of these less fortified vehicles. You found better cover. There was RPGs fired. No one seemed to have been hit by those. What else is happening?
Well, the firing goes from being pretty frenetic to being very sporadic. And it tends to taper off further along. That's a 30-minute tape. And I have 2 or 3 tapes that are half an hour to an hour in length like that. And it's just kind of how the battle went. It was very intense at first. Everybody is firing. I don't think people will pick it up, but there was a Army Reserve crew with us. They had a M240 SAW squad automatic weapon. And they were trying to get that thing to work, and Ellis was cussing his head off, and I was laughing because Ellis just had a way of making me laugh. He was almost a comical guy to me. He was a good guy, but had a good sense of humor, and it was kind of like, of all the crap that could happen to you, this is your chance to get into the fight and now you've got a jammed weapon, and you're under fire trying to fix your weapon.
Yeah,
which is no fun. But that sort of thing happens, especially with our weapons, because our weapons tend to be a little bit more sensitive to dirt and dust and grit, and that was a place where you could have a weapons failure pretty easily. So he's banging away trying to fix his weapon, and other people are firing, and it's pretty intense for a while. People are firing in both places. I think most of it's probably suppressive fire, but, somebody got killed. Nobody with our side did. In fact, the only death that 369 Armor had was the death of Sergeant Wilbert Davis. And that is still unclear to me whether that was caused by them falling under attack, or whether Wilbert and the reporter in the truck, Michael Kelly, whether those two simply fell asleep and flipped into the ditch.
And we mentioned that earlier, so that was what initially had stopped the column, right, because of that accident.
Yeah, I think that's why we stopped. I don't know for sure. I know that when our people went into the airport, there was an advance unit that went in, and there were a lot of Iraqis there that night, and apparently there was some fighting. And in fact, nearby our advance unit, which was headed by Travis Crosby, who was a sergeant, that advance unit on the other side of the wall was an American soldier who was in a pretty desperate firefight, and he literally went down fighting. I think he was the first soldier to receive the Medal of Honor in Iraq. I'm not sure, and I can't remember his name, but Travis told me the story about how they were on the other side of the wall.
And then finally, before we say goodbye with some final thoughts, Sig, we have one more clip.
Shad's firing now. Everybody's firing now. Dad just dropped the clip. Hey. Muzzle flashes, he says they're coming from the tree line. I'm holding my ears too. The squad automatic weapon here is not working.
Yeah, I had a couple of them, man. I just hear them. I'm like, oh shit.
Dan, you had a bullet go by your ear? You're sure?
Yeah, when it comes out, it makes like a kind of a crack,
Look at that Bradley. Pump and fire out of that 50 cal. That was an RPG.
Coming up on the other side of town.
He said they're leaving, Chad. Go ahead. Pull up a little bit more.
They're leaving. Get in.
We're leaving.
And so we heard some more of your voice in this clip, Sig. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, it was kind of a waste of time trying to yell at him because you couldn't hear a damn thing. When both sides are firing in a firefight, you've now squared the noise that the Who makes pretty easily. You've squared it. You made it much louder than a typical Who concert. I yelled at them because they were standing away from any protection. They were literally just standing toe-to-toe facing the Fedayeen, which was 100 yards, 120 yards, 150 yards away, whatever their distance was. It was pretty close. And I was concerned that one of them was going to get hit. They just stood there. So I yelled, tried to get their attention. And So there was a close call. Dan Housley, who's now a pilot for the Texas Air National Guard, he was shooting away, and then he noticed a round that came at him. And the round missed his cheek by about an inch. And he said he saw it pass by him in slow motion. And that is something I would not want to see. I don't know how he managed to see that, but it's really interesting. And in very stressful moments, people tend to compress time. That happened to me in a motorcycle accident. It was like in super slow motion as it happened. And that's what happened to him. And he actually saw the bullet spin past his face. He was a lucky guy. And I think on the whole, our folks were very fortunate that day, because for all the shooting that went on, no one got hurt. The backstory of this is that some time later, on a successive trip that we made to Iraq, I worked with a fixer and a translator, and the driver for us, Qais Abdullah, told us that morning he saw Saddam near Abu Ghraib, and this is where we were. We were pretty close to it. And Saddam was in a limo, and he recalled seeing Saddam giving a woman some money, a beggar money, and then driving off in the limo. We believe that the Fedayeen came out there to slow us down and give Saddam time to escape. That makes a lot of sense. Case and I worked pretty hard to figure out when he saw Saddam, what day. And I went back on my calendar and I said, well, this is when it happened. And so that's a theory. I don't think we'll ever know for sure, but it makes sense. Because when I sat there and wondered why would you come out and fight us, they were outnumbered and they didn't care. So what was the purpose of that? There had to have been some reason. It made no sense without context. And we talk about context on the show. Context and history matter. So why are you doing it? Well, the Fedayeen was a very fanatical outfit. And in fact, after Saddam was driven into hiding, the Fedayeen was still out fighting. They had access to their weapons. They had access to their ammo. And some of those people, they were hardcore Baathists and loyal to Saddam. They're probably still fighting.
Sig, it's been great to have you here on the first episode of Military City, our podcast, of course, devoted to the proud military history of San Antonio, but of course, just, the military, all branches of it here in the United States in many different contexts. We'll be talking about stories from the past, the recent past, like what we discussed today, further into the past, especially in a city like San Antonio. It goes back so far. And talking about the present and perhaps even thinking about the future as well. So, excellent discussion today. I appreciate you sharing a story that was so personal to you, let alone one involving a stepchild that you were somehow involved with in a firefight, so far away from where we are now. This has been just an enormous story, and thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you. The thing I'll say about it is there probably are no coincidences. Things happen for reasons. I believe that. I don't know why that happened, but it did. It was almost as if it were meant to happen. And it was an extraordinary thing that took place. The whole war was extraordinary. I think if this is the time of the year where a lot of Iraq veterans and your viewers and readers everywhere should know this. Iraq veterans everywhere who were part of the invasion this time of the year, they're thinking about stuff like this. They're thinking about how the country settled in after the occupation began. They're thinking about how the insurgency started. And for the people who went back and forth again and again, they carry those memories with them all the time. That's how the war reverberates for everyone who was there. And I feel for them because Iraq will change you in ways you never expected. And it did me. It did Jason. It's it's an extraordinary moment. We don't know where that war is taking us in terms of the policy fallout, but we know that it's a significant moment in our history. And the thing I'm proud of most for this paper is that we covered it. We spent a lot of money doing it, and we went back and forth again, reporting on the war. And we did it for one reason, because what happened in Iraq was local. What happened in Iraq mattered here. Everything going through the hospitals, the military research that was done. San Antonio has been a key part of the war, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So it matters a lot to folks here. And I'm glad to be able to tell the stories about troops that we sent over there, and some of them who came back here and then settled, especially the wounded guys. So thank you.